All right, so move on to the next segment. I'll be sharing my UFC 298 main event prediction between Alexander Volkanovski and Ila Topuria. So this fight will be taking place in the featherweight division, when Alexander Volkanovski will be defending his featherweight championship against Ila Topuria. And this is going to be one hell of a fight that we see in the main event of UFC 298. These are my storylines heading into the featherweight championship fight. So can Alexander Volkanovski bounce back from his upsetting performance that he had against Islam Makhachev in his last UFC performance? You look back at that fight, the last time we saw Alexander Volkanovski in the octagon, he did fight Islam Makhachev, and on a short 2-week notice to save the UFC event, and unfortunately got knocked out in the first round. Is Alexander Volkanovski's confidence back? Is Alexander Volkanovski ready to be back in the octagon after being knocked out disappointingly in the first round to Islam Makhachev, a rematch that he desperately wanted? Is he ready to defend his featherweight championship against a top-tier talent, a top-tier contender, and Ila Topuria? We're going to find out in the UFC at UFC 298. And my storyline for Ila Topuria: is Ila Topuria ready for the biggest fight of his UFC career? He's a good fighter and started off on a hot streak for his UFC career thus far. He's 6-0 in the UFC, 14-0 overall as an MMA fighter. He's climbed the ranks in the featherweight division, 14-0 in MMA, 6-0 in the UFC, like I just mentioned. Will he be able to defeat one of, if not the greatest featherweight champion in UFC history, in Alexander Volkanovski? Will we see a new featherweight champion be crowned in the main event of UFC 298? Time will tell when we get to the event Saturday night in the world of UFC. So my tail of tape for this fight: you have Alexander Volkanovski, who is 26-3. He has 13 knockouts, 13 victories coming away of knockout. He has 3 submission victories. He's the reigning defending featherweight champion in the UFC today. He currently stands at 5'6" and has a reach advantage of 71 inches. And then you look at the challenger, Ila Topuria. Ila Topuria is 14-0. He has 4 knockouts to his resume. He has 8 submission victories. He's currently the number 3 ranked featherweight contender in the UFC today. He currently stands at 5'7" and has a reach advantage of 69 inches. So you're looking at the height advantage goes to Ila Topuria, being an inch taller than Alexander Volkanovski, and then the reach advantage actually goes to the champion Alexander Volkanovski, having a longer reach than the challenger Ila Topuria. So, these are my key victories, the keys to victories. If these fighters want to walk out of UFC 298 with that featherweight championship in the UFC. So my keys to victory, starting off with the challenger Ila Topuria. I do believe that these are the following game plans if he wants to be successful he needs to follow. Starting off with number 1, a good cardio and vascular endurance. Ila Topuria is going to need his gas tank, a solid gas tank to hang around for 5 championship rounds with Alexander Volkanovski. The man, Alexander Volkanovski, has one of the greatest cardiovascular endurance gas tanks in MMA today across the board in all divisions. If Ila Topuria thinks he's gonna have an easy night in the office, he's not. He needs to be ready he needs to be in shape and mentally and physically to go in there for 5 championship rounds with Alexander Volkanovski, if that's what it takes to become the new featherweight champion in the UFC. Next game plan is grappling. Ila Topuria, like I just mentioned, has 8 submission victories in his MMA career. And I do believe if he's going to beat Alexander Volkanovski, the grappling game needs to be picture perfect against Alexander Volkanovski. I truly believe, looking at the film and looking at the tape, as good as an overall fighter as Alexander Volkanovski is, I think Ila Topuria might have the advantage over him in the grappling department. And I do believe this is going to be a good game plan, a good strategy for him to follow for as long as the fight goes on. I do believe that he can control the battle on the ground against Alexander Volkanovski in the wrestling department in this fight. I do believe that he should try to out-wrestle Alexander Volkanovski and shoot for control time and shoot for a submission victory. A control time is very important in championship fights. And a lot of people need to realize that. I mean, a lot of you guys that follow the MMA know that, but control time is very important when it comes to the judges' scorecards because, yes, just for example, we just had the fight between Sean Strickland and Dricus Duplessis, where you had a controversial winner in Dricus Duplessis, but he had the control. He had the control more than Sean Strickland did in that fight, and that's why I believe he won that fight. So control is very important in these MMA fights. I think Ila Topuria needs to have ground control over Alexander Volkanovski as well. But last but not least, I do believe that Ila Topuria needs to be smart in there. He cannot make mistakes against Alexander Volkanovski, because if you make mistakes against Alexander Volkanovski, he will cash in on those opportunities and could cost Ila Topuria the fight if he's not careful. So he needs to be smart and not make any key mistakes against Alexander Volkanovski, because he's a fighter that will cash in on missed opportunities. But look at the game plan for Alexander Volkanovski. It's short and sweet and simple to me. Win the striking battle. Alexander Volkanovski, I just said, is one of the most well-rounded fighters that the UFC has to offer today. Pound for pound, one of the best in the sport of MMA today. But I do believe that Alexander Volkanovski needs to win the striking battle. Alexander Volkanovski hits hard and is the better striker between himself and Ila Topuria. I do believe that it's in his best interest to keep this fight standing. Now, Alexander Volkanovski is coming off a disappointing knockout victory, but he's back in his own weight class at the featherweight division. And I have yet to see anybody win a striking battle against Alexander Volkanovski when that featherweight championship is on the line. So the striking department. Let's see Alexander Volkanovski throw with Ila Topuria, and I do believe that him winning the striking battle will be a key ingredient for him to win this fight. And lastly, use your experience. Ila Topuria is one of the hottest fighters in the UFC today. He's riding a wave of momentum, has been climbing up the ranks in the featherweight division, but he's never fought a caliber fighter of Alexander Volkanovski. So Alexander Volkanovski has been in there with the best of the best. He needs to use his experience and use his championship experience in this fight against Ila Topuria, because Ila Topuria, as dangerous of a fighter he is, he's never faced a high caliber fighter at the likes of Alexander Volkanovski. So use your championship experience, be smart, and let Ila Topuria make his mistakes for you to cash in on Alexander Volkanovski. But, man, this is going to be a very close fight. I will say this is going to be a very close fight, and this fight could really go either way. But I'm going to go with Alexander Volkanovski to successfully retain his featherweight championship against Ila Topuria in the main event of UFC 298. I do believe that Alexander Volkanovski will bounce back from his crushing knockout defeat at UFC 294. I do believe that Alexander Volkanovski will defeat Ila Topuria, and I do believe he's going to use his championship experience, and this will be the reason why he retains his featherweight championship at UFC 298. Ila Topuria has never fought a caliber fighter at the likes of Alexander Volkanovski, and I do believe that inexperience is going to cost him during this fight. I do believe mistakes will cost him against Alexander Volkanovski, and Alexander Volkanovski will win the striking battle against Ila Topuria. I do believe it's in his best interest to keep the fight standing for as long as possible and go into a striking battle against Ila Topuria. I do believe that he's a good Alexander Volkanovski is a good defensive fighter as well. He'll be very patient in this title fight, and he'll let Ila Topuria come to him. He will not make any mistakes. He's a great defensive fighter, and I do believe that his aggressive style is just going to be too much for Ila Topuria to handle, and I do believe that Alexander Volkanovski will retain his featherweight championship at UFC 298. But that is my fight prediction for the main event of UFC 298 between Alexander Volkanovski and Ila Topuria.